right, good morning everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so we will get started. Thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Doherty. I am the President and CEO of the Kennebec Valley Chamber. And thank you to our sponsor, Central Maine Power, for sponsoring our Chamber Connect series. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that this presentation is recorded, so we will be able to share it out as a resource after. You will receive an email. We will also have time for Q&A in the end, but feel free to put questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and Marc will feel free to answer them. Today's webinar, we are joined by Marc French to discuss tips for the new normal, cybersecurity in the COVID-19 era. Marc French is the CISO and Managing Director of the Product Security Group, a product guy turned security leader. Marc has more than 25 years in software engineering, product management, and security. Prior to funding PSG, Marc has held a variety of CISO senior security roles at EMC/RSA, Iron Mountain, Constant Contact, Mimecast, and Dun & Bradstreet. So with so many of our business employees having employees work from home during this time, it is a very important topic at this time. So I will hand it over to Marc to get started. I will stop my share screen and let you put your presentation up.
Alrighty, let me share my screen. 1 second, folks. Please hold. All right. There we go. I assume everybody can see it.
Yep.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me today. Like Kitty mentioned, my name is Marc French. I'm the CISO and Managing Director of Product Security Group down here in Massachusetts. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what's going on. I assume that everybody knows about COVID-19, so we're not going to chat about that at all. But it's presented some interesting challenges for small to medium-sized businesses across the U.S. and across the world. So I thought what I would do today is give you a little chat about some of the things that we're seeing that are a bit unique that have happened as a result of this pandemic. And then also each one of the sections, we're going to talk a little bit about takeaways. So let me just get up there and we'll start. Oops. So who am I? We've already talked about that. I don't need to go in any more detail. We're going to focus really on 3 main areas because I think these, if we're trying to distill this down into groups, we'll talk about people because usually that's the area that causes the most consternation with folks. We're going to talk a little bit about technology and some of the things that you may be doing in order to do this new work at home methodology. And then lastly, we're going to talk about your processes. So we're going to group all of these together. I did put a note here for Q&A. I told Katie that I'm more than happy to take questions midstream. If you want to queue them up at the end, it's really your choice. Also, I'll leave you some contact information at the end. So if you don't want to kind of chime in here, I've got a Twitter handle and an email. So feel free to reach out to me directly. So let's get started. So the way we're going to break the presentation down is basically threats. So things that we're seeing happen as a result of COVID-19 that are a bit unique. And then we're going to give you a series of takeaways for you folks to think about as you go on this journey and things you're going to need to worry about and probably true up as a result of this. So let's talk a little bit about things that we're seeing different. So I don't know how familiar folks are with the concept of phishing. So you get the mail that says that your package has arrived. You should click here to make sure that your FedEx can deliver it on time. So things that folks have probably seen or experienced over their use of the internet, I guess. Really, the 2 things that we're seeing that are unique for COVID are what we call the bring back email. So in Massachusetts, like in Maine, we're starting to open back up. So businesses are starting to kind of get back into the normal swing of things. And what we see adversaries doing is they're starting to recognize that folks are starving for information. They need to figure out, when are they going to go back? How are they going to go back? How is the company going to protect us? So they're taking advantage of that by crafting these phishing mails that they want you to click on and download malware that are in the form of bring back emails. So it could be guidance from the company that says, here's what we're going to do for personal protective equipment. Click here to fill out, your medical survey before you come back into the organization. So what we're seeing is a lot more of these coming into people's mailboxes where folks are taking advantage of the fact that we're opening back up again. The other interesting vector that we're seeing is Vmail alerts. So a lot of folks, they don't have their desktop phone anymore. So they've quickly brought on voice over IP services that translate voicemails that go to their desk phone, and they drop into your inbox and you click on them. So what we're seeing a lot more of is folks recognize that this is how people are working, and they're crafting these supposed voicemail messages that are actually malware that are going to get downloaded into your environment, and you're going to click it assuming that someone called your desk phone. So these are two big vectors that we're seeing over and above what we've seen in the past of, you got a package, or we want you to transfer money to the Nigerian prince. The other interesting thing that we're seeing a lot of is what we call Vishing. This is a concept that you may not be familiar with, because it's been around for a while, but it's resurged with this. And really, it's when they call you on the phone. So we've always heard stories of our grandparents getting calls from Microsoft saying that they have malware. But what we're actually seeing now is they're adapting to contact tracing specifically, meaning that you've got a test, or you've had a test, or you think somebody that has a test, and the people will call up and pretend to be the government saying that they're a contact tracer, and they want more details because you are involved with an individual, and for privacy's sake, they can't do the individual, and they start to ask you for personally identifiable data that they can use to do actually the number 3 thing here, which is identity theft. So one of the biggest things we're seeing down here in the Commonwealth, and I did a little bit of research in Maine's Department of Revenue is having the same challenge, is unemployment fraud. So as an employer, we did our best to try to keep all of our folks on, but the economics sometimes require us to let folks go. And in here in Mass, and it's the same way in Maine, over a certain level, you have to notify the government that you're going to let folks off. Well, that's all public information. So what's happening is the fraudsters are getting on, and they're actually signing up for unemployment for your staff ahead of time. So all of a sudden, you'll get an email or a mail in the regular snail mail, postal mail, that said, we're trying to confirm your unemployment benefits, and you may not have been laid off. So what we're seeing in the security space is a lot of employees that are current employees are reaching out to the organization because they said, I never signed up for employment. Am I going to get fired? Am I getting laid off? And what's happened is they've combined phishing and vishing to actually get enough information to file for unemployment for your individuals that may or may not have been laid off, because they've seen a layoff notice either publicly posted or they've read about it in your local newspaper. So, those three things kind of go together, and it's caused some interesting challenges for companies because, obviously you've got to have mail. That's how we're working today. You're likely going to have, in many cases, a phone. So you need to have some phone capability, and, you've got to take care of your folks when they're in and out of the organization. So those 3 things, and we'll talk a little bit about takeaways here in a second. The next area that we see a lot of interesting threats is the new normals. Everybody's working at home, just like I'm working at home. You are probably as well. Folks tend to use their personal devices. So they may have a company laptop, they may not, and they tend to blur the lines between their corporate device and their personal device. And they start to talk about company business in their personal social media accounts or their personal mail. They start to use their personal devices, which may or may not be allowable in your organization. So you get this blend of data now that's percolated out throughout a whole series of devices that you don't necessarily control anymore. So now if something ever happened, you've got to worry about cleaning all of that data up, or where even that data is across the spectrum of all of these things that people are now using as part of their normal life, where they wouldn't necessarily have done that if they were actually in the office. The last one's an interesting bit. Some folks and some employers here, have decided that they want to take temperature checks. They want to, fill out a medical questionnaire. What we're finding is that organizations are challenged with understanding that data has a medical connotation to it, and therefore has a certain privacy set of privacy controls that it needs to have around it. I mean, I've been in organizations that have posted people's temperatures up on a whiteboard every day as they come in. And really they have to recognize that that is a bit of oversharing, that data is sensitive to that individual employee, and the organization has to spend some time protecting that and making sure that we're not oversharing. The other interesting thing too is you do get employees, we're all part of a community, that want to share about their personal life a little bit more. So just recognize that the more that you're sharing about the procedures that you have in the organization or your medical conditions, the fraudsters pay attention. They can get access to Facebook too if you haven't locked it down correctly. And what ends up happening is they start to gather intelligence about how to commit, say, identity theft. And it may not just be employee, it might actually be Medicare fraud or other things. So, people want to be part of a community. They want to share. Just recognize that sometimes there's oversharing.
Hey, Mark.
Katie, I saw there were a few questions. Do we want to take a couple of questions? All right.
That's what I was just going to say. So one of the questions is, how can I make sure my business is safe when employees are working from home, when I don't have an IT department or know what software they have on their home computer or firewalls?
So we're going to get to that in technology. Can I punt that to a little bit further down the road? Because we're going to talk a little bit about tech in a few slides. So if we can hold that one.
Perfect. And then the other question is, what's the cheapest but safest way to not get a virus?
There are free versions of antivirus on your that you can do. We can cover this in tech, but I'll answer this one. This is a softball question. I'll be honest with you. If you're running a Windows box, the Windows Defender program that comes with it, it's actually pretty good. So make sure that's turned on. Make sure that you turn on your firewall. There's a Windows-based firewall. On Macs, if you're running a Mac, there's something called Malwarebytes. It's free. Just install it, run it every once in a while. All of those things you can get off the internet. But I would say if you're on a Windows machine, use the Windows Defender. It's as good as what you're going to buy from Symantec or Norton or anything else. And it comes with the operating system. So there's no upcharge for that.
And one other question that came in that I didn't answer, but I will say it to the group. They asked, who would you recommend to do a technology survey to survey my business to make sure I am set up correctly to be protected? And I let them know to reach out to the chamber, and we can help share with you some local members in this area that can help as well. So feel free to reach out to the chamber if you have questions, and we can help direct you in certain areas as well.
All righty. Is that it for questions, Katie?
That's it. I'll hand it back over to you.
All right. So let's talk about takeaways, right? So some of the things that you can do that are fairly cheap, right? Because we all have experience, and my business included, a little bit of revenue downturn as we're working through the new normal and folks are starting to ramp back up again. So I think the first thing that I can't stress enough is communicate. Meaning that tell folks what's going on, let them know. And I think the key here is consistent. Fraudsters will take advantage of the fact that you drive inconsistent messaging. So if you have a standard email template and a standard way you discuss, it's a lot easier for your employees to recognize whether or not it's coming from you or not. So if you get misspellings and weird headers and your logo is not the same, that's all stuff that can be a key for employees as you're communicating whether or not it's really coming from the right person. Now, let's be honest. Good adversaries will be able to duplicate that. But if you're consistent in your messaging, and even if it's things like every Tuesday at 9 o'clock, I'm going to send a mail out giving everybody a status update. They'll know that 9 o'clock message is probably the message I need to look at. If I get another message at 12:30, well, maybe that's not really from Sally's business. That maybe that's from somebody else. But I think communication is going to be key, and it's going to be key as we talk about the other two areas as well, because all of the things, whether it's technology or process or people, communicate. Can't stress it enough. Second thing, invest in email security. So phishing is generally the biggest vector in which individuals are compromised and their processes are compromised. So I will tell you that if you're using Office 365 or G Suite or something like that, you already have this. This is not something that you're going to need to pay for. It's probably something that you need to actually turn on and tune though. So this is something that you can do fairly inexpensively with the providers that you already have. At the end, I've actually listed a couple of resources that'll be in the presentation that you guys can read that will help you with this. But this, if you do one thing, is do this, because we see the biggest vector that folks get into the organization is through email. Third, train. So folks just need to know what they need to do. And a lot of times we may not even know what we need to do. So there is some free training out there. Again, I've put a link into the document so you guys can do this, but just give folks information back to the communication piece. They need to understand what they can do and what they can't do. So make sure that they do this every once in a while. You know, we say annually. I'll tell you, you know, most organizations do this every quarter, and they do like a 2-minute video. And the link that I give you, I'm not sponsoring those folks, but it's someone I've used in the past. They're free. Run that every quarter. They talk about things like making sure that you don't leave your laptop in your car, and making sure you don't use public Wi-Fi, all things that they need to do. If folks know and it's front of mind, they'll do it. The other interesting thing that I find successful is if you talk about how they can protect themselves at home, they'll take that into the workplace. So if you, in the training that you'll see, in good training, we'll talk about it that way, because you want to protect your folks at home as much as you want to do the office, and they'll do at home what they do in the office, or vice versa. Lastly is privacy. And I stress this a little bit. Just recognize that you should have some kind of policy to make sure that you protect the private information of your staff and your employees and your customers. Back to the temperature reading. It's okay to collect it in most jurisdictions. Just make sure it's not posted up on the whiteboard. You know, if you're going to do a medical questionnaire, make sure it's not sitting out on the desk and available. So have some kind of process and policy to make sure that people are giving you the right amount of data to be safe, but not oversharing. Katie, you want to go to questions again? Do you have any in the queue?
Yeah, so we have one when you were mentioning phishing.
Yep.
I am a nonprofit, and my board members keep telling me they are receiving emails from me asking to do a task to be completed. Heard this is phishing. How do I stop it?
So, big question. What I would tell you is that you have email security. So there are things that you can tune in whatever you're using for your email provider to actually allow you to stop this, because there are things you can do. And again, I'll point to the resources in the back, but likely if you're using O365 or you're using the G Suite products, you can do this as part of the configuration of your infrastructure, and it won't cost you any more than you're already paying.
So if they don't really know how to do that, they should just reach out to those businesses and they can help them at 365.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give you the document. It might be hard to read the document if you're not a tech person, but I assume that there's folks in the chamber that can probably help them in that configuration. Yep. I'll give them the doc. It's big. It's a bit of a heart thumper. It's a few hundred pages, so it's not for the faint of heart, but it will tell you how to do it. Okay, I would suggest that if you're not a tech person, reach out to somebody in the chamber. They'll help you out.
Perfect. And that's all we have for questions right now.
Alrighty, so let's move on to technology. So, new and interesting threats. So the first thing is endpoints. So everybody's got some kind of device that they're working at home now. I will tell you that, you know, in the past when you're working in the office, you kind of knew where those things were. I will tell you now, they will be in places that you could never imagine where they could be. And that's going to represent some risks, both from the ability to get into your network, but also some physical security risk. You know, if you're maybe out at the beach getting sand in your laptop, as an example. So recognize that your control over those devices that you've given them to work at home is not what it used to be, and prepare yourself for the fact that there's going to be some interesting conversations that you're going to need to have. And we'll cover that a little bit in the takeaways. The next thing, it goes back to the earlier question, the network. So you had one network. Now you probably have more than one network, or hundreds or thousands of networks that you no longer control, because that folks has a cable router or a satellite router in their environment, and you have no idea how they're protecting their infrastructure. And that can cause a lot of sleepless nights for technology professionals is they're like, well, I did all of this work, I put firewalls in, I protected my environment, and now all of a sudden I don't have any of that. So recognize that you don't have that 1 or 2 or 3 networks anymore. You have hundreds, if not thousands of networks you need to protect. And we'll talk a little bit about takeaways and how to deal with that. The next one is probably the one that we see the most. So cloud adoption. So what's happened is folks were working in the office. Maybe they had some on-premise servers. All of a sudden can't go in the office anymore. So we see a lot of organizations rapidly trying to adopt cloud services because they don't really have the ability to work out of the environments that they've stood up inside their infrastructure and in their buildings. So they're running off buying stuff quickly, $2 a head per month. And, we'll talk a little bit about takeaways, but we are seeing many folks maybe not doing enough due diligence about what they're buying before they're implementing it just for the sake of expediency and getting something out there to their staff. The next item is mobile. So many organizations have allowed mobile devices, and maybe they own them, maybe they don't, to access their environment. What we're seeing more and more is mobile is a bit of the new norm. So, your ability to restrict folks using a mobile device to access your infrastructure, especially tied with cloud adoption, is much more constrained than it's ever been, meaning that people are going to use their phones and people are going to use their tablets to access those cloud services that you just stood up to run your business. So if we're not putting proper protections in place, that could be problematic for you when that person offboards the environment, or if they post stuff on LinkedIn or Twitter. And then lastly, and I saved this for last, collaboration tools like the one we're using today. So everybody all of a sudden needs to buy Zoom, or they need to buy GoToWebinar. And a lot of times, the services weren't quite where they needed to be from a security perspective. And I'll tell you that I have seen over the last 3 months a tremendous amount of effort put in by these organizations to beef up their security. They've done 10 years worth of work in 10 weeks. It's been amazing the amount of resources they put into it. But there are still things that can happen, and we've seen them in the news of folks, coming on to school Zooms where they're Zoom bombing is the word they're using to broadcast hate speech and everything else. There are things that we need to do to make sure that we can secure that environment for folks so that that doesn't happen. So these are the things that we're seeing that have adapted a little bit. You've got stuff all over the place. You got a whole bunch of new gear. You got new services, and all of a sudden you got new tools that you're using to communicate. So a lot here. Katie, are there any questions on this section?
Nope, we're good.
All right, so let's talk about takeaways. So number 1, backups. And it's weird that I say this because everybody said backups. We're all in the cloud now. But I will tell you that, back to my earlier point about that machine is going to be anywhere, I always think of it as think cats and kids, meaning that, I didn't share this picture, but my cat sat on my laptop and erased the file that I was working on not too long ago. My friend's kids, decided they were going to play with his work laptop while he was away for a few minutes. So it's more important now than ever to make sure that you have backups of important files. That said, this does not have to cost you a tremendous amount of money. What we've done in my organization and other organizations is, especially if you're using G Suite or O365, use your cloud drive storage. That can function as a backup for you. So instead of you having to go off and buy a backup piece of software or run a tape library, if you're truly a small office and you really just need to get your files off your laptop in a place that if your laptop goes, mount your G drive or mount your OneDrive and sync up your file systems, because that will be up in the cloud with versioning. So if anything ever happened, you can get that data back. We also talk about, back to my earlier point about that data is going to be anywhere. You need to turn on data at rest encryption for your machines. You can do this you can have your folks do this on your mobile phones as well. You never know where laptop's going to end up. At the beach, you left it in the back of your car because you needed to, run in and get takeout delivery because you can't go in the restaurant and someone takes it. That data at rest protection is going to allow folks not to be able to have access to the data that's stored on the laptop or on the mobile device. So, I can't stress enough, this is one of the things, it comes free with all the operating systems. You should look to turn this on to make sure that you can protect that. The last thing kind of goes back to the cats and kids. You need to have a robust replacement process. So folks will do interesting things to laptops and mobile devices at home. They will spill much more. I've seen much more so than when they're in the office. So they're working in a weird spot in their home. They're not in their home, they're outside, and they left it out when the rainstorm came by. That replacement process that you've set up when they're in the office, where you can physically capture the device, give them a new one, provision it, that process needs to be reworked, because you're going to experience likely a small uptick in this. I've seen most organizations that I've spoken to have a few percent increase in the number of replacements that they've had to push out because of home accidents, I'll call it, but also the logistics of how to get that in and out of the environment. So, part of the challenge is, how do I get this person a new piece of gear, and how do I get the other piece of gear back again? And maybe I can fix it, maybe I can't. So you're going to have to rethink the processes that you're going to have to do in order to get your machines in and out from these home places. How do I ship them? Do they, can I do a prepaid box? So all of those logistics you're going to need to work out. Back to our earlier question about networks. So for organizations that have connectivity back in through a virtual private network, one of the things that you can do is ensure posture enforcement. So most modern VPN devices allow you to set criteria in which that machine can connect back into your core network, and this is called posture enforcement. It can look at things like, do you have updated antivirus? Do you have a host-based firewall installed? Are you running, have you done X, Y, and Z? Turn this on. If you've got a VPN device, it will have this. If it's anything, within the last 15 years, it will have the ability to do this. So if you're worried about them connecting with their home PC into your network, this can help you a lot in ensuring that they have the basic security controls in place before they're even allowed to connect into the network. The next interesting thing here is what I call reintegration enforcement. So, back to 100 networks all over the world. One of the things that you need to worry about is, so you've been working at home, we're starting to get back into the office in some form or fashion, and they're going to take that laptop that's been in this environment that you haven't controlled, and they're going to bring it into the office, and they're going to try to plug it into the wall or get on the corporate Wi-Fi. So again, whether it's posture enforcement, there are some corporate Wi-Fi things that you can do to make sure that this happens. You need a plan about how you're going to reintegrate this, I'll call it unknown device, even though it could be your own device, back into the environment. What I see a lot of folks do, and it's fairly trivial to do, and it can be done with any switch that you may have, is create, when a person comes back online and you're unsure of the machine that they're running, you can create what they call a sandbox VLAN, virtual LAN, local area network, which allows you to basically put that box in there and let it run for a little while, make sure that it's good. So then your IT folks, if you have them, can check it, or you can run antivirus on it if they haven't turned antivirus on for a long period of time. You kind of give it a shake, looks okay, and then you can move them back into the regular environment. But what I can say is that you do need a plan for this. And I wouldn't just allow folks to take their home laptop, come back in, plug into your network and have at it. So think about how you want to make sure that you're at least giving it a shake before they plug it back in again, to make sure it's safe before it goes in. We talk about cloud adoption, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, vendor due diligence. Make sure you're buying from folks that are pretty reasonably based and well-known. You can get a service to pretty much do everything. There is unfortunately no Yelp for technology. I mean, there's the internet, you can kind of Google it. But the reality of it is you need to do a little bit of due diligence. Make sure this is a provider that looks like they're reasonable. Make sure they've been around a little while. You're not going to go wrong buying Microsoft or Google or one of the big names. If you're trying to get something economical, just make sure that you kick the tires a little bit and it's a reasonable organization. I would say the thing that folks struggle with the most is identity management. So the proliferation of passwords across all of these cloud services. So for many small and medium businesses, they can't invest in an integrated identity management solution. What I would tell you is that if that's beyond your scope, get yourself one of the free password managers and make sure folks put stuff in there, because they're going to forget, and at least you're going to have some semblance of what they have access to and what they don't. Ultimately it's going to be hard. You got 50 cloud vendors. Everybody's got their own password. It's a bit of a management nightmare, but recognize that when that person decides to leave the organization for whatever reason, whether you're asking to furlough them or they're leaving on their own accord, you need to make sure that they get out of there, because you still don't want to have them to have access to the environment. So identity management and how you're going to manage those credentials is going to be important. And then lastly, train your folks on how to use Zoom. So you'd be surprised on, folks, I can click the link and it comes on board and we're all good and things are fine, but they don't really know how to make sure that there's password or folks can't come in. So there are some free courses out there that'll teach you how to do that. Zoom's actual website, as an example, and most of the providers that can do this are doing a really good job about how to do this now. But make sure folks at least take the 10-minute video on how to use this and how to properly secure it, so that when they are having these conferences, they're not going to run into something like Zoom bombing. So with that, Katie, I'll pause. Questions?
Yes, so we have a question that says, I have Macs and use Avra Pro for device protection, but it does not actually specify email scanning in its features. Is it significant enough? Does it work? Does it suffice?
Oh, I may not know about that product, but I would tell you that most endpoint protection products won't necessarily scan mail. It's better if you can do it at your email provider side. So what you want to try to do is for attachments, you want to have both. You want to have it happen upstream, and then you want to have it at the endpoint. But for straight up phishing, it's so much better if you can configure it at the email provider side before it even hits the inbox. Because once it hits the inbox, those things are pretty good. There could be a 2-second lag. You don't know who's looking, right? And that 2 seconds before the endpoint picks up, that person could go click and do it. And your AV didn't catch it fast enough because it's not quick enough. And I would tell you that any reasonable email provider will do this for you. The other thing that I like about these email providers is they have an intelligence group. So they're monitoring this all the time and they're constantly updating. If you're trying to do this locally on your own system, you probably can't dedicate enough resources that these folks can do. And like I said, you probably have this for free already. If you're using one of the regular mail providers, kind of the normal mail providers, you're probably getting it already. So just configure it.
Perfect. That's it for now.
All right. So let's talk about processes. So some big nuggets here. So we're going to talk some scary terms. So policies and procedures. Some folks have them, some folks don't. It kind of depends on the nature of the business. And we've covered this a little bit, both in the people side and in the technology side. Make sure that you update these, because what can happen is if anything ever happens from a litigation perspective, that they're going to weaponize these against you. So if they're not reflective of how you're now operating, just quickly go through these and make a quick update. It will save you a tremendous amount of headache in the end. If you don't have any, awesome. Nothing to update. You might want to consider having a couple of these. There are a few you should worry about, like acceptable use and privacy more than anything else if you don't have them. And there are templates out there that you can get on the web. I don't know that I put a link in. There's a Twitter that you can ping me at the end. I'm happy to give you a template if you want to look at one. The one that I find the biggest challenge, a non-reflective, is the onboarding and offboarding employees procedure. Back to my earlier point about that machine's probably going to have interesting things happen to it. This is a procedure that IT's probably set up, or you've set up as a small business owner. You probably need to be thinking about changing that a little bit with the new norm and how folks are going to come on and off. One of the things that I find interesting is they do a really great job at offboarding. So how do I get my gear back? They don't do a great job of when I show up on day one, because folks are still hiring and you got new people coming in. How do you make sure that their experience on day one is good when they're not actually in the office anymore. So making sure that the laptop shows up on the first day, they can log in. So recognize that this is probably something that you just need a little bit of attention to. The next one's even scarier. I talked about litigation. This is compliance. So some of us, work in industries where we have compliance regulations we need to adhere to. PCI is the payment card industry for those folks that take credit cards. HIPAA has to do with healthcare data. Recognize that all the things that you put in place to maintain your compliance with these standards and not run afoul of either the government or your credit card brands probably needs to be adapted for your new operating environment. So, make sure that, and we'll talk a little bit about takeaways, but that's going to change. Folks where you had, say, physical security protections because that person was taking credit cards via the telephone are going to be different now because that person's working at home. And maybe you have to change your policies and procedures around that in order for you to maintain compliance. Even scarier, let's talk about insurance, right? So we're going down the scary spectrum here. If you don't have a cyber policy in your environment, what I would recommend is that you get one. It's a very small rider for small businesses that affords you some protection in case you have something go wrong in your environment. What I would tell you, though, is there are a lot of exclusions on these policies. And a lot of times, depending on who the underwriter is, there are coverage exclusions, especially around your definition of office location. So what does that mean in the New World Order? That my office location, I might have been in downtown Portland at a regular office situation, and all of a sudden now I've got people in Augusta and Bangor and Booth Bay and Scarborough and everywhere else. Are those offices now with respect to my insurance? Because what you don't want to have happen is that you have a challenge in one of these places, someone either gets hurt or they have a cyber incident at home on their work machine, and your insurance company decides that they're not going to cover you because it's not what they consider a location. Business continuity. So this is a concept that folks may not be familiar with. So you may be familiar with disaster recovery. How do I get my machines back if something goes bad? Business continuity is how do I bring my business back when it goes bad? So we're all kind of in the throes of this today. Like, how do I continue operating? You all have plans, they ebb and flow depending on what our governors decide we're going to do and what's going to open. But the reality of it is we want to reintegrate. We want to get people back into work. We want customers to come back in the building. And one of the things that you need to be mindful of is how we're going to reintegrate. And I touched on this with the machines earlier and the endpoints. How am I going to reintegrate? You need a plan and a process to get both your technology and your people back into the building. Now, what we're seeing, unfortunately, in the South is it's going the other way. We're not experiencing that here in the Northeast, but you also need the boomerang effect that if things do go a little worse than they're at, we may need to actually go the other way. So having something written down will just help you understand what you need to do and what you don't need to do. And unfortunately, it will also help the next person because you never know when someone might get sick. You need to make sure that people know that plan beyond you so that if something happens, God forbid, that you have a backup in case someone needs to take this plan and run with it. And then lastly, response plans. So, with all the things that we saw, all the threats that we talked about, something may just happen. And you're going to need to respond to that. Whether you can do that internally or you need third-party resources, I'm sure the chamber can direct you if you have some issues with responders that can work in your area. But we see more and more folks getting these, I'll call them minor breaches in the environment because they're working at home and they're blending, like I said earlier, blending their personal and private lives, and all of a sudden they get malware on their box or something happens. Response is going to actually tick up. We've seen most of our customers where response has gone up a little bit. It's not tremendous. It's not like the end of the world, but we have seen organizations that have never had to respond before all of a sudden had to respond. And some of it's as trivial as just run the AV scanner over and clean and quarantine the bad malware, to I need to get somebody in from the FBI because I'm having a problem. So we are seeing a small uptick in responses out there. Katie, we have any questions?
Nope, you're good.
All right, so let's talk about takeaways. So policies and procedures. Make sure you basically give these a shake. Take a look at them, make sure they're up to date with how you're operating. Make sure if you have HR resources that they look at them to make sure that they're not running afoul of any employment law, possibly. And I would also say that, I'm sure the chamber has folks that can help you if you don't have dedicated HR personnel, if you just need a quick review. I'll also tell you that most, standard lawyers out there, I know that can be an expensive proposition per hour, but can do this as well. So a contract attorney, can actually give these a review and make sure that they're up to date. On the compliance side, I use this acronym: make sure you review before they do. It's kind of a play on words. Make sure that you get your compliance in order before your next assessment, because what you don't want to have happen is count on this going away before that next time your PCI auditor or the bank is going to come asking, and you find that you're out of compliance. One of the things that we see, especially with payment card brands, is if you're way out of compliance, they'll start charging you an additional percentage on your card charge, which is going to be a challenge for those of us that are already operating in an environment where we're revenue constrained. So make sure you review these before you come up for compliance. On insurance, I would say to you, now's the time to speak to your agent. So you all are buying your insurance through an agent. Make sure that you talk to your agent about what you're doing as your new world order working happens, because you will find whether or not you have exclusions in your policy for how you've decided to operate your business. There should be a quick conversation with them where you describe kind of how you're operating today. Let them go off and give you advice. This is kind of what you're paying for already, on whether or not you're going to be covered for the operating model that you've chosen. This is extremely important that you do this as soon as you can to make sure that you have the coverage you're going to need in the operating model that you chose. Business continuity, we talked a little bit about this. Just have a plan, make sure it's written down somewhere, make sure it's not on your laptop, put it up in some shared drive somewhere so that people have access. People know about the plan, even if it's just a 7-step checklist. Make sure you have something, because you never know when you're going to need it. And I'll be honest with you, it's building a checklist in mid-crisis is much harder than thinking about it ahead of time. Myself, having been through many incidents in the past, trying to wing it when it happens is harder. Giving it 2 hours of thought ahead of time in putting it down in a 10-item checklist is going to go a long way towards keeping you focused when you need to do it. And then lastly, response plans. I understand that, having a response can be expensive, but recognize your limits. There are things you can do and things you can't do. So if you're comfortable cleaning off malware with the AV system you have, do it. But if it's beyond your expertise, I can't stress enough, you should reach out and make sure that you know somebody to call in case you have a problem. Katie, any questions?
Nope, we just had a comment that said, thank you for your time, Mark. You have opened my eyes to things I have forgotten about.
It happens. All right, so right here, we've kind of done Q&A real time. So if there are no other questions, if they are, feel free to put them in the chat. I've listed a set of resources here. The two general resources, CISA is a US government part of Homeland Security that has a bunch of good resources. The NCSC is the UK government's equivalent. Both of those have a great set of small business guides for security. They're all free. Wiser Training, this is not an endorsement of their product. They offer a free set of training for folks. I've given folks the 2 configuration guides for O365 and G Suite for email security. And then I've also given you the PDF for Zoom security. If there are resources that you are still need to reach out to and you're unsure where to get it, I've given you my email address. Oh, sorry about that. I've given you my email address and my Twitter handle. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to get back to you. I'll be honest with you, it's probably faster if you hit me up on Twitter. I generally, those feed right into my phone. I can get right back to you. But if you have a question about anything that I've presented, or you're unsure of where to get a resource, I can give you a pointer. And obviously, you know, as far as personnel resources, the Chamber can help you out with folks that are a little bit more local that can get to you and give you the resources you need. So if there are no other questions, any other questions, Katie?
No other questions, just another comment saying very informative and thorough. So nice job, Mark.
Alrighty.
Perfect.
Appreciate you guys having me. Like I said, reach out if you have any questions. Other than that, I'm exiting.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We will be emailing this recorded link out to everybody that registered. So feel free to share it out if you think any other of this information might help out another local business around you. Thank you again to our sponsor, and have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
See ya.